Don't say yes.
Don't say no.
Don't go outside.
Don't trust anyone.
Don't drink too much.
Don't provoke.
Don't get raped.
Don't walk alone.
Don't go out tonight.
Don't get drunk.
Don't wear that skirt.
Don't show so much.
Don't dress like that.
Don't smile at strangers.
Don't trust anyone.
Don't say that.
Don't do that.
Welcome to our podcast.
Let's talk about street harassment.
Welcome back to our podcast, Let's Talk About Street Safety. Together with our three special guests, Lisa, Jasmine, and Bianca, we will discuss the psychological and legal implications of street harassment. Thank you all for being here. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Me too.
Yeah, super exciting, curious, so thanks.
Okay, so let's start with you, Bianca, with the psychological perspective. What psychological impact can sexual harassment have on an individual?
That's quite a big question, and I think the best way to kind of look at it is look into PTSD, because that's a nice way to look into trauma, because sexual harassment is a type of trauma, and especially with sexual harassment, often it could be, you can have two different types of trauma. You can have complex and simple trauma. And sexual harassment, because of so many different levels of it, you have, you know, the implications as you as an individual, but also in society, kind of, it makes you feel quite worthless, can often be seen as a complex trauma. And especially in terms of street safety, it can be like something that's a single incident or repetitive. So PTSD is a diagnosis. It's post-traumatic stress disorder. And you can have that, you know, you might have heard in the context of military veterans, those kind of things, but it's also for people who've suffered sexual abuse, unfortunately. And there are three core symptoms, which is the re-experiencing of the trauma, which can be quite scary and dissociative because you feel out of control and out of context. And there's also often avoidance of traumatic reminders. So, for example, you know, you might have difficulty having sex again or feeling intimate with people because you're, you know, that's been violated. And also hyperarousal, so you're more anxious and you're more scared in general. And there's some other symptoms, so you have problems with affect and emotional regulation. So there's often comorbidities with other disorders like anxiety and depression. That's quite common in general when you have mental health problems. Often also, understandably, relationship difficulties, and also negative self-concept. So you feel defeated, worthless, as a failure because of manic stress disorder. So that's like the general response to trauma. And often that's like we see in general that if you, especially had, for example, traumatic childhood, but also with something like sexual harassment, you're just 2 or 3 times more likely to become depressed or anxious.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which already depression, anxiety are really high. They're one of the most common mental health disorders that you can encounter, unfortunately. But yeah, sexual harassment is definitely something that is a huge risk factor.
Oh, okay, interesting. Thank you for sharing. And how about like street harassment? If it's not necessarily sexual, physical, but verbal?
Yeah. I don't know if there's that much research on that because I think that can be quite hard to measure. But you can definitely see that you have the term in psychology like micro stresses or micro trauma, so you can see those something that adds an additive effect. And
okay.
So you could see something like that. So then it's not like a complex trauma, but more of a simple trauma maybe, that it's something that, you know, it highlights to the individual that they are still, though, worthless and demeaned by another individual. And it still, you know, impacts your perception, how safe you feel. And that's also quite significant, quite huge, because that can influence your information processing. So, for example, we have now, in terms of brain research, there's a lot of research now, not only on how traumas and stuff affect parts in the brains, but also we have networks in the brain, so how different parts of the brains talk to each other. And you can definitely see how that could maybe influence. We have a salience network and a default processing mode network. So the salience network is about identifying stressors and salient cues, so things that are important for safety, biologically important things like water, that kind of stuff. And then also the default processing mode network, which is about self-referential processing, which is how you relate stuff in the environment to yourself. And so you can see that in individuals dealing with PTSD, that's different. And so it could also be something that's affected people who experience unsafety on a regular basis on the streets, for example.
Oh, really interesting. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's move over to the legal perspective. So, Lisa and Jasmine, are there any legal consequences for people who catcall or harass women?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the country. For example, in the Netherlands, it is punishable if you catcall people in the streets. In Austria, for example, my home country, there's not. Like, needs to be some physical contact in order to punish that crime. So it really depends. In France, for example, there's also verbal sexual harassment punishable.
Oh, okay. Interesting to see how it differs in different countries. But like in the Netherlands, is it effective? Have there been any reported cases and convictions?
From what I've read, there is a lot of reporting. Like, a lot of people report their sexual harassments, them being catcalled, but sadly there has been none conviction. So it's really difficult to prove that you have been catcalled, that you have been sexually, like, verbally harassed. That's a big issue and a big problem.
And also, if I may add, people who are being sexually harassed, especially verbally, are also often feeling humiliated, so they're afraid to report the stuff to the police. And I think that's a real big issue in general with sexual assault, that people feel humiliated and are afraid to report their cases.
Especially if they know already that they are probably not going to get justice, then maybe it's not even worth going through all of that emotional stress.
And also, usually it's hard to prove the identity of the perpetrator, because it's often only for a few seconds. Like, the person passes by and shouts at you some names, so it's only for a few seconds. So either you barely see her face, or there is no camera. So it's really hard to prove their identity, which is of course necessary to convict a person.
Yes, totally. So you would say that overall there is very little justice for victims in the Netherlands?
Sadly so.
Unfortunately, yes.
Especially for verbal harassment. Because in Austria, for example, there is no justice at all, because there needs to be physical contact. So if women are only catcalled, which is, as the name already says, only like they're called something. So there's no physical
Element. Or
no physical element. So it's super hard to convict people for that. But there's, for example, petitions to issue some new laws concerning that. But it will be a long way to go, I think.
Yes, and especially in the Netherlands, there had been also a lot of campaigns, such as the You Are Not Alone campaign, for example, that had been rolled out in Amsterdam and The Hague and in Rotterdam. So there is some effort that is being made, but the legal implementation is always the most difficult part, I would say.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Maybe if I add, there might also be another possibility of convicting people for catcalling, because in a lot of countries there is also hate crimes punishable. That's used via the internet, for example, if people are hating on you via social media, but also include racist and National Socialist comments. That's usually used for that, but it can also be maybe interpreted as for sexual comments on women, because they, like, catcalling and verbal sexual harassment also, of course, devaluates women. So it's also some kind of a hate crime. Maybe that might also be a solution.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. And for you, Bianca, do you think like what impact can it have on a victim if no justice is obtained?
Yeah, I think there's a huge impact, because already just the trauma itself, right, has psychological impacts. Then you have the next level of going through trying to find justice, which, as they've already established, is quite complicated and difficult. So that's taxing. And then not to get justice as well, I think, is another level, because you have made yourself quite vulnerable and and then for people not to support you or not to believe you in that sense can be quite taxing. Obviously there's huge implications of how do you do this with due process. Obviously you need to identify the perpetrator, but yeah, I'd say there's huge implications for the individual already because the trauma itself is so difficult. And often, like they mentioned before, like you can feel quite guilty, quite ashamed that you shouldn't have to deal with this in a way, and then it's even harder to have to go through that and then to have no justice. So yeah, I think there's going to be huge mental things because you have already the trauma effect, but also like society's effect. If you look at society at large, kind of how they treat the victims and the perpetrators, that can really have a huge, we already said that PTSD and already depression, you have negative self-concept. So that's been reaffirmed in a way with you experiencing that trauma. You might feel that it's your fault, which it isn't. And then, you have society telling you also negative things about that. Maybe you dressed a certain way, or you shouldn't be walking home at night, or that kind of stuff that can feed into your negative self-concept, and that can be quite dangerous.
And I think it's also very problematic because if there is no laws in place that say also verbal sexual harassment is punished, it kind of tells the women that only if they're physically attacked, they are allowed to feel bad, they're allowed to have trauma, and not if they're verbally attacked. So that's also like a big problem, and it kind of shows that women have to swallow it. They just have to accept the fact that they can be verbally attacked.
Yeah, like I didn't know that it was punishable in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
I mean, then how can you report
Yeah,
it? I had
exactly.
no idea. It's really
And that's the first step. Like in a lot of countries, it's not even punishable. And then it, like in the Netherlands or in Portugal, I think, and in Belgium too, it is punishable, but still, like, it is, in reality, it's not punished. Like there's certain any verdicts, so that's like the next step. It's, of course, super good that there's laws in place, but if they're not effective, it kind of raises the question, why do we have that law? So that's you really have, like, the countries have to work a lot on that.
Because I didn't have a question about that because I think that, like, right in like Asia there's a big thing of CCTV cameras, and so would you guys think then is that something that would be needed? Because in general with sexual harassment it's like, evidence, like what is that? That's so weird. And you said you can't identify the perpetrator. Is that something then which would be needed so that you can implement these laws? Like,
I think it would be a huge step in a civil law system as we have it in most of the European countries, because it is against the right to identity or like of personal space. So it clashes with
GDPR
so with a personal right, how much is the state allowed to interfere into your private life? So I think that would be a huge issue, and I'm not sure if from a legal perspective if this system would work out. From a legal perspective, you differentiate between the criminal law and administrative law, which is the criminal law step would be a really harsh step. So putting somebody in prison should be the last step as a punishment. So there are administrative measures, for example, in France, where if a perpetrator is identified, he can pay a fine, which would also kind of create, I would say, like a signal or an image for people to know, okay, if I sexually harass somebody verbally on the streets, maybe in open spaces and public transport, then there is a consequence, and that is, for example, paying a certain amount of money.
Yeah, it would be a signal, because if there is no punishment, people are more likely to do it because they think, why not? Like, I have the right to do it.
Yeah, because then there's the whole discussion also about free speech and where that ends, and it's difficult.
One person ends with the freedom of another person starts. So, But about you talking about street cameras, we're talking about if the crimes are decreasing in an area where there's more street cameras. And I personally think not that much, because I feel like perpetrators, if they do it, they will do it anyways. They won't look around, is there cameras? I might be filmed. They're just like doing it. At least that's what I feel. And additionally, I mean, you just have to put on some hoodie or something, or glasses. So it's really hard to probably also identify the person, because as I said, with the verbally sexual harassment, it usually only takes like a few seconds. The person only like passes by and calls you some names, so it's a few seconds. So you barely probably see their faces. At least that's from my experience. Because if people shout at me on the street, I like rather look down and try to pass by, and not like look at their face and try to recognize them, and like just like rather like out of instinct and move away. So that's like from two perspectives, probably difficult to identify the perpetrator. Like first on the camera it's probably hard, and then you personally probably didn't see the person 100% to be 100% sure you identify the right person.
And also, if I may add, the line is so thin between saying, okay, this is should be criminalized, and this form of wording or saying or these specific words towards another person should be punished or not. So it's difficult to say, okay, what am I supposed and allowed to say and what not? Is it already sexual harassment if I just call a friend of mine out of a joke or something, and with an insult, or like it's difficult to see.
Yeah, because to a certain extent, something can also be perceived differently from like the receiver or from the individual.
True.
So
I think that's a really difficult part.
And also to formulate that in one law, like in one paragraph, to put all different kinds of catcalling of sexual harassment into one paragraph. So because every person receives it differently, so it's like for what might for you be sexual or in general harassment must not be the same for me. So there's also this personal perspective that has to be taken into account, and that's always super difficult to put it into words, to put it into a law.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. Thank you. We can see that we still have a lot of work to do with the legal implications and
There's a lot
regulations. And we would like to end with like some kind of recommendations or how you think the situation could be improved. Bianca, do you think that if the psychological consequences were like taught in schools or on different platforms, if that could promote social change or something similar?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think it just comes down maybe again to the heart of the argument, which is sex and consent. I think consent is a big thing that is completely. I never in school like learned anything about it. Or
Yeah, me
like
neither.
That was like not a thing. And I think just understanding a little bit more the concept of power dynamics and how that's used, and for example, even things like the bystander effect. Like everyone knows what it is. But it's really interesting when you do experiments in social psychology, how hard it is to overcome these things, even when you have awareness about it. I don't know the answer to that, but it'd be really interesting to have, one, a little bit more research on how to talk about consent and that kind of stuff, because it's complicated. Unfortunately, it should be easy, but it's not. And then to also understand about social processes that underlie these things. So, for example, the bystander effect, or like you said, the negative consequences, just to have lots more education on this, I think is important, but definitely to see, okay, what are the social processes underlying the bystander effect and how do we break that? How do we get people out of that loop? Because it's actually quite horrific. I remember hearing this like that, you should, in the US or something, you should shout fire instead of something else because people are more likely to react to something like that. I've heard that as a rumor. I don't know how true that is, but there's definitely kind of an element that, we were saying like what is sexual harassment for the individual. That's people have different levels of tolerance for this. So to understand maybe the bystander effect and how other people can put in, because it can't just be the victim responding to the perpetrator, because that's not going to be particularly effective, because we need more people to be able to say, okay, yeah, that was sexual harassment, or to have some kind of witnesses or something. So I definitely think, one, consent and sex is huge here, because consent in general has lots of different implications, not only for sex, but then also looking at the social process, I think would be super interesting, especially the bystander effect. Everyone knows it, but everyone does it. So how do we break it?
Really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, such a good point. And what about you two?
Maybe another thing that just came up in my mind, that in Spain there's a new law introduced about that women have to say don't have to say no they have to say yes in order to get consent. Because of course a no is a no, but what if they say nothing? Like if they just let it happen? And in Spain that's also a no now, so they really have to say yes in order to make it consent. And that's also I think a good way of seeing it. It gives an image, like if because in a lot of situations the women probably feel very inferior and that they cannot say no, and then they just let it happen. So that's also very important, I think, and it should be like that in every country. But yeah, there needs to be laws in place, and that's also, like we said, a long way to go. So that might also be some kind of legal recommendation that has to be established.
And also, if I may add, I think educating people is just one of the main parts, both from the psychological perspective, but also from the law's perspective. Because as Bianca said earlier, she didn't know about the law in the Netherlands, and me neither until I did the research. So I think educating people at a young age already and implementing this into the form of education, may it be in school or also in universities,
as an impact campaign,
just as we have it here, is a really, really important step.
Yeah. Maybe like also because it happens on the streets, like street harassment, maybe you can put up posters to like spread awareness, because that's like it happens on the streets, so we have to spread the awareness on the streets.
And using social media, of course, for communicating stories that you've heard, that you've self-experienced. I think communicating and opening your mouth, opening your eyes is a good thing. And
there's this movement, Cat Calls Off, in a city like Cat Calls Off, New York, for example, and that's a movement that is also spread via Instagram, and they record, or the people send their recordings of their sexual harassments, their catcallings they experienced, and then the people of the initiative, they write the phrases with chalk on the places where they experienced the harassment. So that's also actually like a super nice initiative.
Yeah. The last thing I want to add, what you said was really nice within Spain with the concept of consent. I remember learning I did a course on sex, so we talk about safe sex, and the whole concept of like practicing these types of conversations is a big thing, because it should be, you have lots of power dynamics and you feel inferior or something like that. So I think that's another level. It's not only like awareness, but there's a little bit of research now in psychology about like how to practice these conversations to increase self-efficacy, which is the belief that you can do something. I think that's a big thing as well, because it's not easy to say these hard things and weird social process going on. So practice makes perfect. So I think that's another level that would be nice to add.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's this is a good argument to stop our podcast. Thank you all for being here. It was really interesting and informative, and I hope our listeners can learn something new.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, like I learned something new, so that was great.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, was not bad.